We go. All right, so this is the beginning of chapter 2 lecture on the theory of evolution, and this will correlate with chapter 2 in the explorations textbook. All right, so Charles Darwin did recognize that he studied finches. So he studied finches. His original studies were on the Galapagos Islands, and he noticed that all of these finches looked similar, but also had variations in color, had variations in beak shape, had variations in the tone of the songs that they would sing during breeding season. But he hypothesized that these finches were all descendants from a single common ancestor. And he hypothesized that these finches were adapted to survive in very specific environmental roles or niches within their island environment. We're going to call that adaptive radiation. We'll define that in more detail here in a moment. But Charles Darwin noticed that these finches were similar, but also different. So when we're thinking about evolution, I want us to try to erase that image that we always see. So let me just show you in a Google search engine just to prove it to you. Oh, go back here to share. So when you type in the word evolution, see if I can get out of this PowerPoint slide here. Oh, there we go. Okay, now I need to Google. Nope, that's not what I need. This is what I need. So if you go to just a random search engine and you type in the word evolution, okay, and then we go to images. So the image that pops up constantly is this image of a chimpanzee on one end, and then a gradual linear progression from a quadrupedal, a chimpanzee that moves on all fours, and a gradual transition to a bipedal human that walks on two legs. Okay, now all of these images of evolution are incorrect, or at least a misrepresentation of how evolution actually works. Okay, so evolution happens as branching events. So I want you to start envisioning branches on a tree. So like this one here is a better image of how evolution actually works. Okay, so there's all of these branches represent groups of organisms. Okay, now this one isn't even as complex as it needs to be, but you guys get the picture. This is a much more accurate representation of what evolution actually is. Evolution is bushy, it's messy. It doesn't necessarily happen in a linear, neat fashion. It's not one species to the next. Okay, so I want you to start by kind of erasing that classic image of evolution out of your mind. Okay, so Darwin developed the theory of descent with modification, or what eventually became known as the theory of evolution via natural selection. So natural selection is based on the concept that individuals with preferential characteristics will survive and reproduce at a higher rate in comparison to individuals that do not possess those traits or characteristics. Okay, now this is going to vary depending upon the environment we're talking about. What's beneficial on, in the desert, for example, may not be beneficial in the tropics, or what's beneficial in the tropics may not be beneficial in the Arctic. Okay, so natural selection is the principle that organisms will have differential survival based upon the characteristics that they possess and also the environmental circumstances they find themselves in. Okay, so some examples. Let's talk about the rock pocket mouse. So the rock pocket mouse has two different forms. There's a light colored form that has basically kind of brownish fur. And then there's a dark colored, there was a mutation called the MC1R mutation that turned the fur black. Okay, so the rock pocket mouse lives on the southwestern desert. So as you can imagine, if you're a little teeny tiny mouse, and your predators are mainly aerial hawks and eagles. So hawks and eagles that are flying above you, looking down to see if they can see a mouse and then swooping it up. So if you're living on the sandy desert that's mainly brownish in color, you would want your fur color to be also brownish in color because it's more likely that you're going to camouflage, that you're going to blend in and not get swooped up by that hawk or eagle. Okay, so in that circumstance, in that environment, the genes that code for the brown colored fur have the advantage. Okay, it's more likely that those mice are going to survive. And if they're more likely to survive, then they're more likely to pass along those genes to future generations. But there was an environmental cataclysmic event that really shifted that environment. There was a volcanic eruption, and once that lava cooled, the substrate, the ground, became almost blackish in color. So I'm sure you guys can kind of predict what's going to happen here. So all of a sudden, those mice that have the MC1R mutation and the black fur, all of a sudden, those are the mice that are going to be more likely to blend in with the substrate and not get swooped up by the hawk or eagle. Okay, so all of a sudden, now the black colored mouse has the advantage, has the selective advantage. They're going to be more likely to survive and more likely to pass those genes along to future generations. Okay, so I like that example because it's a simple example, of course, but it gives you a really measurable way of looking at two different fur colors and how the brown colored fur was advantageous in the desert environment, but then after the volcanic eruption and the substrate turned black, all of a sudden it completely shifted. The directional selection shifted towards the black colored fur having the evolutionary advantage. Now, it's important when we're talking about evolution and natural selection. There's some other misconceptions that we want to get rid of right away. It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones the most responsive to change. So that's a very famous quote by Charles Darwin. So survival of the fittest doesn't necessarily mean survival of the strongest, or survival of the smartest, or survival of the most aggressive. It just means who's best at surviving in that environment. And the strongest, aggressive, most intelligent isn't always the best at survival. So it's just important to remember that survival of the fittest has nothing to do with how good or how strong you are. Okay. Sometimes it's quite simply what genetic traits that you inherited. All right, so some more vocab words. So the term adaptation. So you probably heard the word adaptation before. It refers to any change in the physical structure, function, or behavior that allows an organism or a species to survive and reproduce in a given environment. Okay, so when we think adaptation, we oftentimes think about physical changes, a change in fur color, a change in beak shape, a change in a change in hair color or eye color, something like that. We tend to think about the physical, but adaptations are also sometimes behavioral and functional. Okay, it could be a way that we adapt to a new environmental circumstance. It could be a new way of obtaining food or a new way of breeding and attracting mates. So, adaptations can be physical or behavioral. Okay, so adaptive radiation is defined as the diversification of an ancestral group of organisms into new forms that are adapted to fill specific environmental roles or niches. So the image on the screen here on this slide on the right-hand side, so at the bottom, we have our founder species. We have sometimes also called the common ancestor. So those two terms are used kind of interchangeably. Sometimes it's called founder species, sometimes it's called common ancestor. But you're going to see evolutionary events happen, speciation events. So all of these branches, all of these offshoots are representing adaptive radiation. So you notice these finches look similar, but they also look very different. Some finches have the really long, kind of straw-like beak. So this finch here, this one consumes predominantly nectar from flowers. So that really long beak acts like a straw that they stick into the flower and suck out the nectar. Okay. And then you see over here, these two finches have kind of short, robust, strong beaks. Okay. So those finches are adapted to consuming seeds because they use those really strong beaks to break open the seeds. Okay. And then the finches that have kind of in between, the kind of short, skinny beaks, they're eating mainly insects. Okay. This one eats kind of nectar and insects. Okay. This one eats nectar mainly. This one also eats nectar and some insects. So you see all these variations. And when you think about it, that's really advantageous to all of them. Because if they were all trying to eat the same exact thing and exist in the same exact habitat, they would come into direct competition with one another, right? And of course, competition is going to happen. That's just part of the game, right? Competition is going to happen. But if you can avoid it to an extent, then that's going to be better for every single organism within that environment. Okay, so that's what we mean by adaptive radiation. Those finches are adaptively radiating out to fill very specific roles in their environment. Okay, so some finches eat mainly insects, some finches eat mainly nectar from flowers, some finches eat mainly seeds, some eat cacti, and everything in between, right? But the big benefit is that, they're not all competing for the same exact resource, okay? So a silly example I always like to use is if we were all in a classroom and let's say I brought in one of those big, big bags of candy bars that has a whole bunch of different ones, right? Some Snicker bars, some Almond Joys, some Milky Ways, some Butterfingers, some M&Ms. You guys get the picture. Let's say that there's 10 different types of candy bars, and it's a huge bag of candy. Chances are every single one of you, even if all 40 of us were here, chances are you would all find something that you liked, right? But let's say I only brought in, maybe it was even the same amount of candy. Maybe it was the same number of candy bars, but let's say they were all Snicker bars, or they were all Butterfingers, or they were all Milky Ways, or all Almond Joys, something like that. Okay. Chances are, even if I had enough candy bars, chances are there would be at least one of you, or probably a few of you, that maybe didn't like Almond Joys, or that was allergic to coconut, for example. Okay. So if I bring in a wide variety of candy bars, chances are everybody's going to be happy. But if I only bring in one candy bar, one type of candy bar, even if I have enough supply, if I only bring in one kind, then chances are at least one person's not going to be happy, right? So I like to use that example because I think it's a good way of kind of understanding what I mean here by adaptive radiation. So all of those finches, they all like different candy bars, right? They all like different types of candy bars. They all like different types of food. They live in slightly different environments. The Galapagos Islands, they're a chain of islands. So the environment is similar, but it's not identical. Okay. All right. So that's what we mean by adaptive radiation. Do we have questions? Doing okay? All right. So last slide we'll go over today. So Darwin viewed evolution as simple biological change from generation to generation. So he recognized that many species on this planet may be connected by a common ancestry, especially species that look similar to one another. Darwin's theories on evolution were quite controversial due to the predominant religious doctrine of the time. So most religious texts, regardless of, what religion you ascribe to, or maybe that you don't ascribe to, but a lot of religious texts do suggest that the planet is somewhere around 10,000 years old, right? Evolution, I mean, the evolution of humans alone goes back about 6 million years, according to paleontology and geology, essentially. The planet itself, according to geology, is about 4.6 billion years old. Okay, so, I think it is very possible to entertain and to even support the theory of evolution without abandoning any of your spiritual or faith-based beliefs. Okay, as long as you have an open mind about the time frame, as long as you recognize that, evolution needs a lot more than 10,000 years to occur, it is quite possible, at least in my humble opinion, it's quite possible to believe in both, or at least entertain the idea of both. So just because you're taking a class on evolution, I don't want you to shy away from it, because I think it's very possible to learn about evolution and to learn about what it is without having any conflict with your religious beliefs. Okay, so I just really encourage you, if that's anything that that kind of makes you shy away, just hang in there with me for a little bit, hear me out. And because I can promise you I won't ever grade you or judge you on your opinion. My purpose here is only to present the scientific facts that we have thus far and let you make up your own mind. Okay. All right. So Darwin particularly faced backlash and controversy regarding the evolution of humans. Because of course, humans were a little bit arrogant, right? We like to think that we're somehow separate, somehow better from the rest of the animal kingdom, when in reality, we're not. We're just a species within our ecosystem, just like any other species is. But yes, of course, especially during the time where Darwin was first presenting, at that time, I should put hypothesis on the slide, because at this time it was a hypothesis. So at the time he was presenting this hypothesis, it was quite controversial, and he did face quite a bit of backlash. Okay. So, and we'll talk about in our next lecture, we'll talk about the reasons why Darwin delayed the publishing of his findings for such a long time. And we'll talk about what finally influenced him to go ahead and publish his findings. Okay, so that we'll save that for our lecture on Monday. So I'm going to go ahead here and stop the recording.